In some of my other audios, I've spoken about the importance of developing an emotional language and an emotional vocabulary. Our emotions play such an important part in our lives, and the kind of relationship that we have with our feelings and the way that we cope and handle our emotional responses will have a massive impact on our everyday quality of life. All relationships involve communication, and when there's a lack of communication or some kind of a language barrier, then relationships can become fraught with difficulty. So to relate to ourselves emotionally, we need some kind of a language. It creates a connection between our mind and our feelings. We need a good flow of communication and understanding. This is one of many audios that's designed to help to build an emotional language and to help to enable this kind of communication. So I'm going to talk about what I call emotional equations. One of the reasons I use this kind of terminology is that it creates a kind of basis or a framework that helps us to recognize and understand more about the role that our emotions play for us. Creating this kind of language and framework helps to make it possible to begin to stand back and notice what's actually going on for us emotionally. When we're in the thick of things and our emotions are very intense, we can easily feel overwhelmed. We can't see the woods for the trees. So standing back from ourselves, being able to notice what we're feeling is a very important and very valuable skill. When we deepen our awareness of our emotions, we can begin to understand what we're feeling. And this in turn helps us to be more reflective in our responses, and less reactive, and less fearful of what we feel. And we can begin to notice what's working for us in our lives and what isn't. Let's talk about emotional equations. Emotional equations are a kind of emotional formula. They describe the way that our emotions react and interact. They describe the relational mechanics of our emotions and the way that they operate. Let me give you some examples. Thoughts generate feelings, and feelings generate thoughts. It's like a kind of loop. This is an emotional equation. So let's say that you're feeling anxious or uneasy for whatever reason. Your mind can then generate all kinds of thoughts in response to these feelings, and this in turn will generate further feelings. So if you feel anxious and this generates anxious thinking, the kind of thinking when we get stuck in going over everything that might go wrong, then this will actually generate more anxiety. It's a loop that can spiral. Anxiety plus catastrophic thinking equals more anxiety. It's an ever-increasing equation. But if you feel anxious and you can generate reassuring thoughts, then the equation is actually very different. Anxiety plus reassurance equals resilience. Here's another emotional equation. Sometimes when we're feeling something, one emotion can actually trigger or generate another. It's like a secondary package of emotions. So we start out feeling one feeling, and then we experience an emotional response to this. Let's say, for example, that I find myself feeling anxious, but I'm not sure why. Maybe an underlying unease. But because I don't understand why I'm feeling this way, I can then become frightened of the way that I'm feeling. We can have this kind of response to almost any intense emotional experience when we don't understand it. So we start with an intense emotional package, and then we feel frightened by this. So one intense emotion plus fear equals a kind of double whammy. We've just doubled the load. Here's another emotional equation. Our emotions have a fluid relationship to time. And sometimes our past and present experiences become emotionally amalgamated. They get tangled up. We might define this particular emotional equation as a reliving of the past, but in the present. The past and the present have become intertwined in a way that we may not be fully aware of, and yet we can be living with the results of this. Let me give you an example. If we've ever experienced something particularly difficult during our childhood, then the way that we felt at that time will be stored inside of us as an emotional memory. If we weren't able to really process that experience and the way that we felt about it, then when we encounter a similar situation, even if it's many years later, it can trigger an emotional response that's way more intense than the actual here and now situation requires. In fact, sometimes our responses can be really inappropriate and out of proportion. So we have the here and now situation with its own emotional package, plus a past situation with an emotional package, and these have amalgamated and become tangled up, which equals a very intense emotionally laden experience with a confusion about what's really going on. This emotional equation of past and present amalgamating and becoming entangled is far more obvious in adults. When we're children, it's different. We're still in the making, and we're still in the process of developing our internal systems and frameworks. The equation of one set of emotions adding themselves to another situation can actually happen in a variety of different ways. And as these audios develop, I'll actually explore these ways in much more depth. But just for now, here are a couple of other examples. They're both something that often happens in our relationships. We all grow up relating and being related to. This is a baseline principle. But when something doesn't go well for us, perhaps as children our basic emotional needs weren't met, then later on in life we can bring these unmet needs into our adult relationships. And this can place an inappropriate emotional expectation on our partner and a burden on the relationship. So in this equation, a childhood need, perhaps a need to be parented in an emotionally responsive way, will become attached to an adult partnership. It's an additional package. And in an adult relationship, this can create tremendous strain and difficulty, especially if we're not really aware of what's actually going on. So we have appropriate adult needs, plus a set of unmet childhood needs, often unrecognised, and this equals a relationship where both parties frequently end up feeling let down and disappointed. Here's another example that happens in relationships. Sometimes when we meet someone, they can really remind us of someone else, someone we've known before. Now sometimes we're aware of this, but sometimes we're not. When this happens, the way that we feel about the person from our past, the package of emotional memory that's attached to them, can literally become attached to the new person that we've met in our current time. And when this happens, we can start to relate to them as if they're someone else, as if they are that person in our past. Somehow it's coloured our perception of them, and it's coloured the way that we emotionally engage with them. So if the emotional memory that belongs with the person from our past was good, then we might approach the new person with rather rose-coloured glasses, with very good expectations, but possibly unrealistically so. However, if the emotional package was difficult, then we may take a strong dislike to someone, even though it might be completely unfounded and we haven't yet got to know them enough to discover who they really are. So in this equation, a historic emotional package sits on top of the current one. The package from the past is greater than the package from the present. The package from the present is barely developed as yet, and the larger cancels out the smaller. And this can result in a distorted perception of a current new relationship, or even a current existing one. So these are examples of emotional equations. We need to develop an emotional language in order to know how to listen to our feelings. If we have no emotional language, then we won't have access to the full range of our emotional experiences in a way that's healthy and appropriate. Thank you for listening and take care. This is copyrighted material 2014, Jenny Burgess, The A to Z of Emotional Health. All rights reserved.